Hello, this is going to be the desktop presentation for Lesson 2, Topic 2. So Lesson 2, Topic 2, where we're talking about secure network maintenance. Here's the terminology. Not every single, some of these terms will come up during the presentation, but not all of them. Again, terminology, the purpose is to get you to understand some things that you might hear. So we have the word and the definition here. These are all definitions that could be possibly used every day in IT, especially false positives. Every day in IT and IT security parlance. We are going to be going over the concepts, so let's get started. There's only, I had it running already. There's only 5 slides, but there's lots of concepts, so we're going to be spending a lot of time on these slides. Let's get started then. First step. So what we're going to talk about here is secure network maintenance. Once we have a network designed, in the previous lesson we talked about setting up the architecture of a network, which includes everything from top to bottom of a network, not just the network, but the user's interaction with that network. And we talked about network design and implementing secure concepts within that network. So once we have it set up and we think we have a fairly secure network, it's bloody useless if we don't secure the network, okay? Or if we don't maintain that network, right? Security is a matter of maintenance, of vigilance. If you're not vigilant, if you're not maintaining it on a daily, monthly, weekly basis, then it will become less secure. One of the things we have to worry about is change management. We talked about that a little bit earlier, particularly when we talked about administrative controls, because it's going to be done by administrative controls. There's no device as of yet. When are the machines going to come for your job? There's no device as of yet to handle the change management of a corporation, of its IT systems, although I'm sure someone would love to build it and sell it. So, why is it important? Well, change management, if we're talking about changing a system, and when we talk about changing a system, we can be talking about changing anything and everything from a web server, talking about the operating system, the directory structure, the actual web page, web pages, how they interact, any system change, right? Or we can be talking all the way up to an entire network redesign, and from layers 1 to 3, 1 to 4, how we're going to handle how's the network going to transport data from point A to point B. All this could be possibly change management. Obviously, part of that change is going to be a change of our attack surface, okay? Attack surface is something we talked about in Internet Security 1, but our attack surface is how our entire potential and vulnerability, right? Our attack surface is our facing to the outside world. It's not necessarily a vulnerability, but it could develop a vulnerability, right? And that's what we're talking about, our attack surface, right? If we offer less services, then we're reducing our attack surface, right? So we're changing our attack surface. We might actually have vulnerabilities because of a change. We might have less vulnerabilities, ideally, because of a change. But we have to manage. All that has to be managed. Okay, so how do we manage it? Well, we're going to have these 2 illustrations I took from our book, as it Planned IT Change, Practical Change Management for IT Projects was the. I took it from that secondary book that you do not have to get. But it's a source that I'm using for this particular lesson. All right, so. But the concept is this for change management, and this is the other frame that really applies to that book. I like this drawing a little bit better, although this one's prettier. This one is actually a little bit more sensible. How do we have successful change? What is successful change, I suppose? Defining what successful change is. It's when we replace a system with another system and get benefits from it. Either more efficiency, better product, better customer care, better whatever, right? Better operations. For whatever, in the case of IT, remember IT security, we can either improve the access to information, the integrity of the information, or the confidentiality of that information, right? Whatever we've increased, we've gotten better performance costs out of the system by changing the system. Okay, that would be a successful change. However, there's going to be a number of possible. It's in order to have successful change, you need multiple columns to hold it up. If you neglect one of these columns, then the whole system could fall over and topple over. Okay. First, though, what I want to talk about, and that's these right here: organizational design, stakeholder management, communication, training, and frameworks. What I want to talk about most important, though, which is not over here, is sponsorship, and it's the bottom floor. All this is built on top of, or I guess it's contained under sponsorship, or it's built on top of sponsorship. But sponsorship is important. What does sponsorship mean? We had a lengthy discussion, which was great in our online, in our in-class lecture about this, to try and define what sponsorship is. And what I came up with was essentially the capital, both financial or material, and political. That's people are willing to spend to support your efforts to change. Okay, there's not always the sponsorship. Well, we're going to talk about that, right? Change is hard. Change is really hard. Okay, change is difficult, especially if it's culture change. Okay, people like it how it is, and they don't want to change. Even if they don't like how it is, they tend not to want to change all that much for fear that it might get worse. So change can be really difficult, and if you don't have the financial material, in the case of IT, device, new products, new devices, or most importantly, political capital, then that change is going to have a hard time working. All these columns, which support successful change, are then further are supported themselves by sponsorship. Okay, it's also, though, it's a two-way street. Sponsorship kind of cuts both ways. Well, let me finish up on the political sponsorship. What I mean by political capital is leadership of any entity. When you're in charge of something, you learn rather quickly that you can't just simply stick your chin out, Mussolini-esque, and tell everyone how everything's supposed to be, and just it gets done with no questions, right? Every time you have an initiative, every time you tell someone to do something, you're expending political capital, okay? And if you don't have the political capital behind you to fight some of the difficulties you're going to run into, which we'll talk about, then that change is going to have a hard time being implemented. All right, so let's talk about some of the columns here. We have organizational design. In other words, it's looking at the actual design of the organization, right? The actual, and then redesigning it, or looking at that design and coming up with a better system, right? We have to have stakeholder management. The stakeholders are what's key, and I was going to talk about that two-way street of sponsorship. It also flows from lack of a better term, but below, right? Sponsorship also comes from the stakeholders, right? If the stakeholders are willing to change, when I say stakeholders, who do I mean? I'm referring to the people who the change will affect, right? The day-to-day, the line workers, the people on the line, the day-to-day people who the system is going to affect. You're going to need their buy-in. Why are you going to need their buy-in? Because they're the ones that do the work, and if they don't think the system is good, even if it is good or isn't good, they will resist it, and the system might fail. You need them. They are. That's where they represent one of the columns, right? So you can't just bully ball your way in and say, listen, this is the way you're going to do it. Shut up and do it, right? That goes into another thing of communication. When we talk about communication, we're talking about both ways. We're talking about talking to your leadership of sponsorship, where you are in the project, how things are going, what you want, communicating on what you actually want, and to the stakeholders, right? When you communicate to the stakeholders, what you want to do is, part of this is training, but what you want to do is tell them the changes that you think need to be made, the reasons why those changes should exist, and how that can make their life better, okay? And the fact that we're trying to make their job better, the system better, okay? And training is going to be part of that, right? That's the last column here, training. We have to train our stakeholders. We need to train our users, right? If we don't train the users, then they don't know how to use the system. It doesn't matter how good the system is, right? A Ferrari is slow if you don't know how to drive stick, right? So people need to know how to work the system, okay, in order for the system to be any good. Now, frameworks. when we talk about frameworks, this is kind of what we're talking about. Is, again, we've mentioned this before when we talked about in our architecture. What's a framework? It's just a general guideline, much like this, of how to do change management, right? And there's multiple different frameworks. This isn't the only way. If anyone knows me, you know me, that I don't think there's one set way to do everything, right? But a framework is essentially a outline based off of previous experiences, right? One interesting book, case in point, is Culture Change, The Emotional Side of Change, how to change something where people do not want to change. There was an interesting book from Chip and Dan Heath called Switch, How to Change when Change is Hard. The rider, the elephant, and the path is their system, is the way they kind of talk about it. If you think about an elephant rider, particularly in like India or other nations, but I know they're most famously associated with India, that the elephant, if the elephant doesn't want to move, or if there's a mouse that crosses in front of the path, right, that is the right path, if there's a mouse in the middle of that path and the elephant doesn't want to go down that path, it's not going to go down that path, right? The rider needs to gently, and almost as a teamwork, right? It's almost as a team, the rider and the elephant, and the rider knows the right path and needs to gently guide the elephant. Some would say passively aggressively, but I would say just with constant, subtle force, get that elephant down the right path. Okay? Anyway, it was an interesting book in that regard. You will find this as a recurring theme. I'm just giving you kind of a heads up. This is that if you work in IT long enough and you find yourself doing some kind of system analysis and design or pushing out new systems, this is something you're definitely going to bump into. Is people are going to resist change, okay, for better and for worse. Sometimes it does make sense to resist change, right? Sometimes it isn't, okay? So some things that you might want to look for is team integration. So at the design phase, don't do it by yourself, right? You can go into a redesign with preconceptions, but you better prove out those preconceptions and work with a team. That way you can get feedback, and hopefully it helps with the stakeholder management and the communication, all right? Interdepartment communications, interdepartment comms, all right? And to fight misinformation, okay? Often when it comes to change or big projects or any kind of project, misinformation is a big problem. Hopefully with having interdepartmental communications, you will fight against those misinformation. So it is important to keep everyone in the loop for that purpose. Okay. All right, so that's my very long spiel on change management. There are change management boards. There are processes in place of larger corporations of how to implement change. Some of those processes are great ideas. Some of them are tedious and painful, like pulling teeth. Access management. All right, now people move, people get hired, people get fired, people change departments. People change their job responsibilities. Okay, that happens on a day-to-day basis. It feels like it's every day, but probably 4 or 5 times a week, depending on how big the company is. You're going to be asked to change people's access to different areas. Okay, in the case of IT, you're going to be asked to change accounts access to data. Okay, you're also going to have to change accounts themselves, credential management, which we'll talk about in a little bit. We'll talk about passwords and stuff like that. But right off the bat, let's talk about access again. I guess we'll talk about accounts. We'll go in order. So accounts, right? There's all kinds of changes we might have to make. We have to make a change to a username. To their password, to reset a password. That's a password recovery. We'll have to talk about that in a real sec. Remember, password policies have a number of settings in Windows, but generic names, we have password expiration. That's how long until a password is no longer considered valid. Remember the concept of diminishing returns. That you can have a user change their password once a week, but if you do, they might write it down somewhere. And this is going to be true for a lot of these password things. Passwords are a funny thing, right? There is a lot of situations where the more complicated, the more difficult you make a password, the less secure you're going to be, because you're forcing the user to write it down. Hopefully they keep it in an encrypted file somewhere, and even if they do keep it encrypted, is it a proper encryption? Yeah, it's going to be really difficult. So a lot of this is finding a happy medium. This is why a lot of people are moving to two-factor authentication, which we talked about a lot last semester in Internet Security 1. But anyway, so we got password expiration, how long passwords how long they're going to be good, and before the user has it changed again. We're going to have account lockout threshold. How many guesses do you get until we lock you out? Account lockout. Account lockout, hold time. I'm trying to get back the actual term here. I have them all here in our definitions. Password length, password history. I did mention that in class. Reuse, account lockout. How long we want to keep you locked out of your account. So if you get locked out, if you have too many bad guesses, you hit the threshold, and you have, let's say the threshold's 3, and then after 3 bad guesses, how long do we want to lock you out? Remember, this is a tool against online password hacking. In other words, I'm attacking an active database, not offline, where I'm attacking a system which is not in production, right? Online attacking, this is an important feature, because what it does is it further delays how many guesses this person gets before in a certain amount of time. All right. So we have threshold, we have lockout, of course, password complexity, which is a hot button issue again. FBI just put out their new recommendations where they just said make it as long as possible. We don't even care about complexity anymore. All lowercase, whatever, we don't care, as long as it's 22 characters. We rather have 22 characters. Which then a student brought up today, well, what if it's 22 A's, right? Obviously that's not ideal. The fact that it's 22 it's tough to be overly simplistic. Passwords are an interesting, fascinating thing. If you took Internet Security 1 last semester, you would remember we did a little bit of password cracking and how interesting it was, right? That if you say your password is an uppercase character, a lowercase character, a number 0 through 9, and a symbol, well, I'll happily attack that, even if I don't know the order. That's only 4 characters, right? I have my guesses are limited, right? So anyway, it's an interesting dilemma with passwords, and whether or not, the problem with passwords, I mean, so there's lots of problems with passwords, something but they're not going to go away anywhere soon, because, there's lots of people trying to come up with better systems, and there just isn't an as easy as secure system, right? There are more secure systems, they're just not as easy and as secure. And remember, diminishing returns when it comes to credentials, right? The more difficult we make credentialing for users, the more shortcuts they're going to find, therefore haywiring our more complicated credentialing system. All right, I went way too long about accounts. Sorry about that. So accounts, changing passwords. Password reset is an interesting thing. Nowadays, we're pretty normally set on having two-factor authentication. If we recover our password from a website, what do they have us do? They have us send out they send a text out to our phone. Well, that phone is something we have. It's something you have. It's a second factor, and then we can change our password. In the early days, we just did a double something, and we what's your mother's maiden name, and we would tell them, hopefully, and spell it correctly. In my case, since Zibikowski was not the easiest thing to spell, anyway, long story short, that would it was another something right, which wasn't ideal. So how are we going to deal with password recoveries, right? By the way, we have the most complex system in the world, and I just was listening to a podcast where someone hired a hacker, and they this particular hacker immediately just went in. It was a female. She called this reporter's various accounts and just had them rechange passwords. She had a very endearing voice. She'd get a tape recorder in the back or something, on her phone. She'd get an application where it made it sound like a baby crying in the background. Put that somewhere just in the distance, right? And then give a sob story how her husband was sick or her boyfriend was sick in bed and was, or her father of her kid was sick in bed and couldn't get to his cell phone, and I just need this password change so I can get to this account and get food and diapers for the kids, and how successful she was. So there you go. We got the most complicated recovery system in the world, but just be haywired by social engineering. Anyway, so these are all things you have to worry about, right? More importantly is access, right? Again, access is going to change. People and their job responsibilities are going to change. People get hired, fired. So we're going to have to keep an eye on what users have what access to what files and what data. Okay, so permission auditing and review, right? We're going to figure out who has permissions. We're going to try to apply the policy of least privilege, right? The policy of least privilege is simply says is you should have as much privilege as it is to do your job. Again, that's easier said than done. It's an everyday wear. It gets on. It weighs heavily on your soul, and sometimes you are overly generous, and other times you're angry at the world and you're overly mean about it, and don't give all the users all the privilege that users need to get their job done. So finding that happy medium ground is tough. But again, access is going to come and go. We're talking about read access and write access, right? So how do we do an audit of this, right? Well, what we try to do is data classification, figure out the most important data that's at the enterprise that you're working at, get the list of users that have readability, the users that have writability. If write's more important than read, then pay more attention to that, and then go through the audit logs, right? We're going to talk about that in a bit when we talk about logs, but the audit logs will indicate who accessed the files, when, how often. And if we don't see an account access the files at all or once in a great while, we must ask ourselves, why do they have that ability? If they're not using that ability, therefore they don't need that ability. If they don't need that ability, why do they have that ability? All right, that's all part of the auditing process, going through logs. Okay, which we'll talk about more on the next slide. Group policies are a great way to push this out via Active Directory. Again, I have my Linux students who poo-poo Windows and all things about Windows, but there is just nothing that beats Active Directory when it comes out to doing access and account management. Pushing out those changes. Active Directory integrates that all into one system. Yes, it's pricey. Yes, it locks your desktops into Windows, but that's what your users are used to using anyway. And if you really want to train 500 people on how to use Linux, by all means. So group policies are a great way to push out password policies, certainly, but account changes and deal with access management. Reviews and audits. So again, we have to have reviews and audits of our access. We can do it internally, and we can do it externally. Again, we'll talk about this in a second. So we can either do it internally or externally. All right. So let's talk about more alertness, shall we say? Logs. It's easy to set a system to record a log. It's tough to find the time to go review those logs. So we have, in general, two overarching log types. We have system event logs. These are event logs generated by any kind of system, network, or more likely operating system. That tells you what's going on, usually up, down, critical faults, errors, memory errors, that type of thing. Audit logs are usually used, this comes particularly from Active Directory and Windows. Audit logs come from accessing files, right? Every time the object, I should say, every time an object is accessed, it's going to, an audit log will record who, what, where, when, okay, access that file. Seams, which I said in class real quick, and I didn't double check. So let me, security and information event management. I think that's what we did. security information and event management. I think that's what I said in class. I can't remember. But anyway, a SIEM essentially is a all-in-one. I should have put it at the end. So let's talk about log aggregators first. A log aggregator essentially collects logs of different types. Now remember, when I said system event logs on any kind of system, I mean any kind of system. We can have logs from switches, we can have logs from routers, which might be a different vendor, logs from firewalls, which might be a different vendor, log from different types of servers that are running different types of operating systems, right? HVAC systems, who else is going to look at logs but just IT? I mean, you hand that to facilities, they're going to go, what is this? I'm not reading that, give that to IT. So any kind of log, right? We have all these different kinds of logs that may follow slightly different formats. They're usually pretty good about following syslog or some kind of format. So what we're going to have is a log aggregator, something that collects all those logs and puts them in one site, making it easier for us to check, especially if I have like 50 switches in a corporation, right? I don't want to go switch by switch by switch by switch, checking all the logs. I can have a log aggregator that collects all those logs. All right, and so that's a log aggregator. It's going to collect all the logs. So let's talk about SIEM real quick. A SIEM kind of does this log aggregation. It also can collect all kinds of different information. Technically, SNMP is not a log. It's a trap generated by an event. So it can collect these events that occur. It can look at these events. It can look at up-down status. It can look at processor load, RAM load, any kind of information like that. And what it can do is make predictive problem solving or alerting of certain thresholds that are violated, depending on how expensive and good the SIEM is. Lower end SIEMs I've seen go for as cheap as $500,000 maybe, SolarWinds, to high end ArcLight from HP I think is close is around 120,000 I think. Anyway, point is, I'm sure it's different depending on who quotes it. And that would be more predictive, right? It would notice certain events occurring. Like for every 10 minutes, someone keeps guessing at this one account on a web portal, right? And so it might sit there and say after three nights of that, it might say, you might want to check that out, right? So it might send an alert about that, which we'll talk about in a second. It's false positives, false negatives. So a SIEM is a little bit more proactive, right? It's going to manage all that stuff, all right, for you. Now, reports. Talking about reports. So the good thing, another thing a SIEM might do is generate a report. So something you can. Remember, we talked about one thing we want to do is log monitoring, right? We want to monitor our logs, right? We want to look at our logs. Well, if a SIEM or if I can get a log aggregator that can make a query on that I write myself, generates a report that can be easily read by me or someone else that, or hopefully multiple people, that will tell us let us look at trends and possible events on our network. So that's a report. All right. Monitors. So again, we're going to have different types of monitors. We have intrusion prevention, intrusion detection system. Along with that, I have to mention false positives, false negatives. Again, I think we talked about it here, but we certainly talked about Internet Security 1. False positives are every time we are alerted to a situation and that situation turns out to be false. And a false negative is even scarier, right? False negatives are when something bad is happening on our network and we're not alerted to it. It's a false negative. All right. So false negatives keep us up at night. False positives keep us up during the day. All right, because we're going to keep getting alerts from false positives saying, "Oh my God, there's an emergency," and you go check it out. It's been an hour, and it turns out that someone's kid followed them to work today, and they plugged in, they jumped their tablet onto the wireless network, right? So anyway, that's false positives, false negatives. Baselining is something you're going to have to do as any kind of good monitoring system, especially intrusion detection or intrusion prevention. We got a baseline. In order to know what's an anomaly, we have to establish a baseline. A baseline is normal. What does normal everyday traffic look like on my network, right? Not into the philosophical debate of what is normal. Good luck defining normal and not causing problems by defining what normal is, right? But nonetheless, we have to set up a baseline of what we expect day-to-day traffic to look like, traffic and interactions and downloads and backups, and what's our network look like, right? That's creating a baseline. Traffic monitoring kind of goes into that, but we can also dip in it at some point to just look at the traffic. That being said, part of that is firewall monitor. This is a thing. Apparently, I can't say I've ever done it. I've tested firewall configurations, but usually I just sit there and sit on a lower security interface and try to do the thing that should be blocked, and I'm happy when it's blocked, even though I know it's running as a service on the server. But apparently some people will actually set up a traffic monitor on one side of a firewall and one on the other side of the firewall, and see the request go into the firewall and watch that request die and not show up on the other side. Okay. Excuse me. So cloud security, that's a growing trend in our field, because more and more services are being pushed out to the cloud for cost-saving purposes and offloading of work, really. So data loss prevention is a big part of that. DLP, that is whenever we deploy a system, either be it manual or automatic in a system, which is becoming more and more prevalent, that just verifies that the information that comes and goes from a system is not classified as sensitive, and if it is, it can blank it out. We all get the credit card statements at home that have our credit card numbers X'd out except for the last four. This is the type of thing we're talking about. That's the DLP. That's sitting there saying you don't need the full credit card number, but here's the last four if you want to just go in your wallet and figure out which credit card this is about, right? But you don't need the whole credit card number, and therefore we don't have it out there, and that's a good thing, right? Same thing with cloud security, right? If the information is not meant to be out in the cloud, then DLP will prevent that from getting out in the cloud. Cloud security, cloud access. Cloud security. Let me close this, minimize this real quick.